Greetings, everyone. Happy New Year. I hope the holidays found you well. And since the holidays are now officially over, it's time to get back to work. So, this first video of the year is going to be me discussing the last track find that we found last year at Bayley Lake. So, let's get into it, shall we? Alright, just to give you guys a recap of everything. On Saturday, September 15th, my wife and I found a series of tracks out at Lake Bayley in the Little Ponderay Wildlife Refuge. Now, the tracks, there was at least over 200 tracks, three sets, a 12-inch track, a 7-inch track, and a 5.5-inch track. So these tracks came down from the mountainside from the west side of the lake through a marshy area and then along the edge of the lake, and then they turned and crossed the road and up into the woods heading east. So this is a bird's eye view of Bayley Lake and the Little Ponderay Wildlife Refuge, and I'm about to show you the pathway of all three tracks and how they were laid out the way we found it in September. So the red line you see there indicates the 12-inch track. It came down from the west side of the hillside and traveled along the lake, and then eventually went out into the water, back onto shore, and then along the lake again, and then turned and went up the east slope. Now this yellow line indicates the 7-inch track, and this little guy was all over the place. He crisscrossed the larger track several different times and eventually even went out into the water and then back onto the shore and followed the larger tracks in the same direction. Well, I hope you can make out the two purple lines there near the lake. This was a track line of the 5.5-inch track. Now this little guy only appeared a couple times in this whole track line, which makes me think that this little guy was carried in and then carried out. Now, this little guy kept close to the lake, but in between it stayed in between the 12-inch track and the 7-inch track. So maybe it was a baby. Now, these are just different angles of the lake with the track line showing. Now that you seen the terrain that we were in and the direction of the pathway of the tracks, let's jump into some of the questions that we were asked. One person asked us if the tracks could have been hoaxed, and one of my partners that was out there with me asked the exact same question, because these tracks just looked perfect. And we examined the tracks, and one thing that we noticed is the movement of the foot. We saw how it interacted with each step it took, how the toes were raised up when it stepped on a rock or a stick. We saw different movements in the foot itself when it slid, or just the way it was walking. One of the tracks stepped on a rock. You can see how the toes were raised up when they rested on the rock, and the ball of the foot sunk deeper into the mud. So that told us that we were dealing with an actual foot in motion. Plus, we noticed that there was dermal ridges throughout most of the tracks. We noticed those dermal ridges inside the toes, the foot, and on the heel. And you can see those dermal ridges in these pictures of the casts. They came out beautiful. So that tells us that we were dealing with a real living foot of something walking through this area. Another question we received was one person suggested that could these been bear tracks, and I don't believe they were. I have seen tons of bear tracks, black bear, grizzly tracks before. We've even casted bear tracks, and nowhere at any moment in any of the tracks did we notice any kind of overlapping tracks at all. Um, and with all these tracks being in this soft mud, there would have been indications of claw marks. We saw tracks from every other type of animal out there, especially coyote, cougar tracks, and we could see the claw marks from those prints in the mud. And these tracks showed no signs of claw marks. So we could pretty much rule out any chance of a bear track. One of the most dominant questions we received was, did we send any of this stuff to Dr. Muldrin? And the answer is yes. But we also sent photographs and information to multiple other researchers that we have met over the years to get their viewpoints on. Now, the majority of these researchers were very excited about what we had found, and they have also said that they have found similar tracks, the same types of size and appearance in areas all around the country. So I sent off 2 emails, one to Muldrin and one to Cliff. Now, I made the email very vague, and I sent a couple pictures and said, hey, I found some tracks. What do you guys think? Because I wanted their first impression answer, and I didn't want to give them any more information besides that, because I wanted to know what they thought by looking at it with no real information given about it. So I can't remember exactly which one responded to me first. So I received an email back from Dr. Muldrin, and his response was, it looks human. And then he asked me, were you sleepwalking? And that kind of like irritated me right off the bat. I was hoping for more of a professional answer. I know they probably get tons of these types of emails all the time, but I was hoping for a little better response than basically insulting me like I was sleepwalking. So that irritated me just a little bit, but then I had a chuckle about it. Now I received an email from Cliff, and he said the same thing. It looks human, and but he gave me a compliment on the casting job that I did and told me to keep up the good work. So Cliff won my respect out of the 2 of them, and so I decided to give him more information about the tracks that we found. So after I explained everything that we found, from like the stride, the pattern of how the feet were laid out, the direction, everything, I suggested, since there's not a lot of case studies of juvenile tracks, could these possibly be juveniles? So he responded back to me saying that with all that new information now, he said that that doesn't sound human now. It sounds more like a Bigfoot related incident. So he wanted me to photograph all the tracks from multiple different angles so he can really study the tracks. So while I was doing all that and getting that information sent off to Cliff, Muldrin sends me an email asking me for more information about the trackway, which I found a little odd because he thought they were human and, made the little joke about me sleepwalking. So I found that a little odd that he was wanting more information about the trackway. So I was wondering if he had found some details in the tracks that made him interested in, getting back to me. But I was still kind of irritated from his comments, so I waited a couple days before responding to Muldrin. So I eventually sent him the same information I sent Cliff, and I never heard back from him. So Cliff gets back to me after analyzing all the pictures of the casts, and his final judgment call was saying that they were human, and he gives me 2 examples of why he thinks that. One, in one of the casts, the ball of the foot was very dominant in one of the casts, so he was implying that whoever made the footstep was stepping off of the ball of the foot, which is a very human trait. Now, Bigfoot track, he implied, would be more more flat-footed. and would lift up all together instead of lifting off from the ball and the toes. And he also indicated that the pinky toe on the cast was closer to the other toes, which he said would imply, possibility that, this foot was used to wearing shoes, because a Bigfoot track would be more, the toes would be more spread apart. So he gave me some good examples and a good argument to dismiss these tracks as Bigfoot tracks. But he also admitted that there's not a lot of information on juvenile tracks. There's just not enough case studies about them to actually make a judgment call on juvenile tracks. But he is basically saying that he thinks these are human tracks. So I respected his answer, and that's what we like to do. If we can debunk something, awesome. But out of all respect, and this is how I conduct my research, is never dismiss anybody's claims of a Bigfoot report. For one, I mean, even though the story might sound really far-fetched, you weren't there to witness it. So you don't know what they saw, what they were feeling, what they were experiencing, any of that. And you should never just automatically dismiss things because you weren't the one there. So since I was the one there and saw these things, Cliff wasn't there, Muldren wasn't there, maybe they would have felt differently if they had seen every single foot in the mud and everything. Maybe they would have had a different opinion. Who knows? So now let's focus on arguing towards these being possibly Bigfoot tracks. So let's talk about the difference between a possible juvenile track and a full adult-sized Bigfoot track. We can wrap our minds around seeing a Bigfoot track, an adult Bigfoot track, because of the size of it. So we're looking at, let's say, a 15-inch, 18-inch plus track in the mud. We're going to say that's an adult Bigfoot track. But when we see juvenile tracks, they appear more human size. So we are immediately ready to dismiss any chance that those are Bigfoot tracks because they're so small. Now, the average height for an adult Bigfoot is between 7, 8 feet tall, which means their weight is probably between 400 to 800 pounds. I think we can all agree on that. Now, a juvenile is not going to be a full-size adult. It hasn't grown into its feet yet. So a juvenile will probably weigh between, I'd say, maybe 190, 200 pounds, somewhere like that, depending on its size. So it's not carrying the huge amount of weight that an adult Sasquatch would be carrying. So its tracks are going to appear probably more human looking than an adult track would look like. And without that extra amount of weight on it, that track's going to look a whole lot different in the mud. Now let's talk about the stride of these tracks. Now, the average stride of the 12-inch tracks was between 3 to 4 feet. In certain areas, the stride increased to about 5 to 6 feet in certain areas. Now, even the 7-inch track measured between 2 to 3 feet in stride length. But at moments, there was parts of it where this track was between 4 to 5 feet in stride length. I don't know if maybe it hopped a little bit or what, but the strides were there. Plus, the pattern of the tracks in the mud were perfectly aligned with one another. And all the tracks appeared to be that way. They're all walking as if you're walking on a tightrope, one right in front of the other. We tried to recreate that, and it was difficult for us, even in the mud, the deeper part of the mud. And it was a bit of a stretch. Now, I'm 6'3", and I was stretching my legs out pretty far just to match some of these strides. So for someone to walk a good little over a quarter of a mile across deep mud and keep that stride without stumbling, that's pretty good skill there. Plus, the soles of these feet had to be pretty tough. because they were walking and stepping on all kinds of debris from sticks, rocks, logs, and there was no sign of them like stumbling or sidestepping this stuff. They were just stepping right on top of everything. And if these were a human child walking around, um, I've watched our grandson play on the river, and I mean, if he stepped on a little tiny little pebble, it's like he acts like his foot just got cut off. So I saw no signs of sidestepping anywhere to avoid any of these obstacles. And I mean, they stopped right on logs and sticks and everything. And most people would probably like tiptoe around certain areas like this, but these things just went straight through it all. So for the argument's sake of the tracks looked human, they weren't flat-footed enough, and the toes didn't spread apart. Well, here's an example of what my human foot looks like. Um, when I first started out, I wanted to be able to compare a human foot to a possible Bigfoot track. So I casted my own foot years back, and I keep this in my casting kit with me at all times, so I can always have it there to compare, you know, the two types of tracks. So you can see that my cast of my foot there, I'm a size 11. This is the size 12 track here. You can see how narrow and skinny my foot is compared to the 12-inch track that we found out there. Even my heel is really narrow compared to this thing, and it it's a lot much larger and wider and deeper than what my foot looks like. So the other argument is that the track didn't seem flat enough. Well, from this picture, it looks pretty darn flat to me. Um, Plus, also the weight, depending on how much this thing weighed. Um, if this was a juvenile track, it wasn't, carrying the huge amount of weight to create a super flat foot. So, I mean, even in the cast, it shows it to be pretty darn flat. So, and even the toes, I mean, the toes are supposed to be, as Cliff said, more spread apart. Well, there's still quite a bit of gap in between those toes. And even if you look back at the cast of my own foot, my toes are all kind of like pushed together because I wear shoes. Um, but if I had shown him the other pictures of some of these tracks, you could see the toe spread was quite drastic. Now, I wonder if Muldren and Cliff would have thought differently if they had saw pictures like this one, where it shows the toe spreads all spread apart, especially that big toe. I mean, look how far of an angle that one's sticking out there. Um, if that's the argument that, it has to be a Bigfoot track if the toes are spread apart. Plus, that foot is fairly, very flat. Um, so I wonder if they would have changed their mind if they had seen these photos, because I didn't share everything. I just shared what I casted. Now, I didn't cast this one track because I ran out of plaster. Maybe I should have, and it would have made things a lot more easier. Now, this was one of those 7-inch tracks, and you can see here that it had some weight to it to push up that much mud on its next step. Now, everything we documented here, filmed, photographed, measured, we did it all by the book, and everything we found has fit every category for a Bigfoot track. And just because they're not giant in size, they're immediately dismissed. Now, I know there's a lot of good science out there, and I know there's a lot of bad science out there. And I think it's all kind of mixed together. Um, if the track is not gigantic and just mind-blowing, we just immediately dismiss it. And it makes me wonder how many tracks are we overlooking because it's not large. Now, I've come across human-looking tracks way out in the mountains. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason why someone would be walking barefoot out there. And back then, I just dismissed it as, oh, it's probably just some kind of hippie person or something just running around out there. And never even dawned on me that, it could have been a juvenile Sasquatch. Now, if there's any possibility that these are juvenile tracks, and if anyone else is finding small human-like tracks out in the middle of nowhere like this, fitting these characteristics, I think they need to be documented and seriously studied, because there could be a lot of information that we can learn from this. Not all Bigfoot tracks are going to be gigantic. I mean, they got to start off small somehow, right? So I guess it's just going to be another one of those, you find some evidence, but you can't prove that it was actually done by Bigfoot. So I guess I'll just leave it at that and keep on searching for better evidence.